Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for taking your time out of today in terms of attending the Green Ribbon event, which is titled Behaviours of Shame. My name is Donie Pardy. I'm the Head of Environment, Health and Safety and Wellbeing at AIR. And together with Sea Change, I suppose they're partnering with organisations to celebrate 10 years of the Green Ribbon campaign. So the Green Ribbon theme for 2022 is shame across the month. And Sea Change have been exploring what shame is, how shame presents itself, and how shame impacts other people with mental health difficulties. But I think the key thing in terms of the theme and the tagline to remember is that there is no shame in having mental health difficulty. Throughout the week or throughout the month, we've had a number of events. And the first week, we started off with understanding the topic of shame. And I suppose we focused on chronic and toxic shame. I suppose kind of when it affects one's sense of themselves and kind of when it's internalized and when it can kind of contaminate the way that they would see themselves. So in week two, then we basically looked at what shame actually looks like. So in terms of society and kind of what negative impact it can have on our mental health. What shame feels like was in week three. I suppose it's just the emotions that are brought forward and the thoughts and the feelings that it can induce. Today's seminar is the behaviours of shame. So basically the way in which one would act, I suppose. So we probably think of the self-destructive behaviours like drug or alcohol use, but isolation, avoiding others, becoming sensitive in certain scenarios, or pretending or misrepresenting yourself. So in just a few moments, I'll be joined by a fantastic lineup of speakers, including Nicholas Nally, Outreach Director from Dublin Samaritans, Claire O'Farrell, our Health Promotion Specialist, Spectrum Life, and Eoin Kernan, our Sea Change representative for the day. But there's one other event which will conclude the months of worth of events in terms of the topic and the theme, and that's a week to see change. So what is the antidote to shame? So we're looking forward to the presentation next week, and kind of would encourage you to log into that as well when it comes available. So kind of how validation and unconditional acceptance can be the key to dealing with the shame. So this and other events across the month are being recorded. So I would encourage you all to kind of keep an eye on Sea Change's social media, the website, and if you can spare time, just jump across to the website, and I suppose continue to learn about the topic and the theme and the negative impacts it can have on our mental health. But by educating yourself on the topic, I suppose, and sharing your experiences and starting the conversation, we could all help to end mental health stigma. So our discussion today will approximately be about 1 hour, and there'll be questions and answers at the end of the session. This will be a safe place for everybody, but if some of the content discussed does cause negative effect on your mental health, please check out the care pathways that our colleagues are going to post in the, the Zoom meeting here. And basically they will provide support and advice and assistance for you if necessary. So I suppose kind of AIR and kind of why AIR are hosting this event, and we're delighted to host this event. But our partnership with Sea Change began, I suppose, in early 2018, and we had just launched our AIR Wellness program. It was called AIR Wellness: Live Life, Live Well. And I suppose our approach at the time was to connect up all of the services with regard to employee well-being and kind of integrating them into one offering by the company. So by using that brand, we were able to kind of expand on all the good work that we were doing in the company, and kind of using a steering committee, bring together HR, occupational health, CSR, and even just our union partners to kind of come together as one and provide hopefully the best and health and wellness supports that you could get offered through a company. So we partnered at that time with Leia Healthcare and have worked closely with Spectrum Health and other partners as well. But I suppose kind of on that journey, and it quickly evolved once we had established that service and started to get information, as in to say, well, who else can we engage with? And Healthy Ireland was one in terms of lining ourselves up with their national framework. But we're introduced to Sea Change by our union partners. I suppose they saw the opportunity at the time to provide the green ribbon through our distribution network within the retail stores. But it was good fun for me in that sense, because that's when we really opened up our conversation about mental health, because Sea Change came in and they said, well, this is who we are, this is what we're trying to do, and basically, are you that type of workplace? Are you the one we want to partner with? And I suppose it kind of identified that the workplace can be a key setting for changing attitudes around mental health, and kind of making a difference in terms of ending stigma. So again, we were opened up to a vast amount of resources that they had in place to help us learn and to understand the sort of programs and frameworks we needed to put in place within the company. So eventually, once we got all of those structures in place and they give us a great deal of assistance with our policies and procedures, we were able to take the pledge. And I suppose that kind of pledge then kind of cemented our approach to the way we want to deal with mental health within the company and the way we want to kind of offer our services out. So again, we're very delighted to be partnered with Sea Change here today, and looking forward for what the years ahead can bring for us both. So I suppose, what are we doing in AIR was kind of the question I was posed in terms of, before I hand over to our colleagues, but I kind of wanted to simplify it in terms of what we are actually doing. We're having a conversation in the same way the mental health conversation should be approached. So we're talking to our management teams, we're talking to our employees, and all of our other stakeholders, and kind of meeting up with the likes of Sea Change and all the external partners that are out there, and trying to ensure that we're giving a best-in-class health and wellness support. And kind of in that approach, we're doing the small things that can make a big difference. We're not nailing it, we're not the best in class. We're doing all the little bits and pieces in terms of providing offerings within a framework that works and kind of brings results. And we've kind of seen that in terms of that connected health model that we've put in place. We've seen great results, and now we're kind of learning that maybe we kind of need to look at our wellness more in depth, and kind of sit back and say, well, let's just stop throwing wellness at our employees. Let's actually further engage with them and see what are the key topics that we can work together on to improve the overall mental health and well-being of our staff. But we're also listening as well, and I think that's a key factor to all of this. We've made plenty of mistakes on our journey, and we kind of need to continue to improve our processes and procedures within the company. And by doing the listening, we can get the feedback from our employees and kind of engage everybody in terms of the mental health topics that we need to deal with as the environment changes. A colleague of mine said last week it was kind of a cascade of anxiety-inducing events over the last number of years. And we've seen that, and I think mental health has come to the fore, and we're kind of seeing it also in the data that we have collected, that it's becoming more and more of a concern and an issue, and it's something we need to address and kind of continue to provide support to our employees. So then I suppose the other thing in terms of mental health conversation, don't just talk about mental health. And I think that's an approach we take in AIR. It's a holistic view at wellness. So it's live well, be well, think well. And I suppose kind of what we want to make sure is that we're providing proactive healthcare before somebody's health status changes. I mean, reactive healthcare is not exactly the approach we want to take. We want to stop somebody from becoming ill or experiencing difficulty. And we do that in a number of different ways in terms of the services we offer. And just thinking there, Air Challenge was completed last week. My legs are still a bit stiff from it, but we had over 600 employees who partaked in that challenge, where basically you run, walk, or jog. And we raised over 50 grand for the Special Olympics charity. Just over the last number of years, that's over 500,000 that the company has raised in total. But it's going back to that connected health piece. That was a standalone thing before we sat down and looked at this. And then we said, let's bring that into Air Wellness. It's very much so relevant, and it can be offered alongside other services within the company, where we can take this holistic approach and in turn kind of deal with mental health on a number of different levels. But I think the key thing to remember in terms of that mental health conversation is continuing to educate ourselves. And that's what we have to do, and that's essentially why I'm hosting this event. It's educate myself on the topics and the sort of strategies that are out there to provide assistance to our employees. So that's my approach from here in terms of the introductions. I'll kind of, the structure will get a little bit weak now in terms of what I wanted to say, but what I'll do is I'll pass over to Claire Farrell now, our health promotion specialist for Spectrum Life. She current role with Spectrum Life and Leia Healthcare, and a strong mental health focus in that, and it involves kind of hosting mental health seminars and running mental health well-being campaigns and events. So Claire, I'll kind of hand over to you to kind of discuss the topics, and yeah.
Thanks so much, Donie. Thanks a million, and thanks as well to Rebecca for inviting me to be part of this panel. So I'm just going to share my screen. Can everybody see that okay? Just if I can get a thumbs up.
That's perfect, yeah.
Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, so as Donie mentioned, in my current role in Spectrum Life, I would run a lot of the mental wellbeing programs, but my background is actually mental health promotion officer with Mental Health Ireland. And from there, then I went on to work with mental health reform. So I've been in the mental health kind of space for about 5 years. So what I've learned in that time in terms of, I suppose, shame behaviours. So shame is universal. Every one of us on the call will have experienced it and will probably know that it's not very pleasant. And it's usually about a specific insecurity or a specific event. And why is that a problem? I suppose the reason it's a problem is because shame can prevent help seeking. It can also prevent us from fully participating in society, in our roles or in our social lives, because we might have negative beliefs about ourselves. And also, as Donie mentioned, shame is a problem because it can lead to self-destructive behaviours. So a definition of shame then is a feeling of humiliation about ourselves or our behaviour that we might judge as wrong or foolish. So kind of a more generalized or persistent shame is really linked to feelings of worthlessness and feelings of low self-worth. And that's quite toxic. And really it's associated with mental health challenges, and like that low self-worth, low self-esteem can be a real challenge for people. And what that might look like would be familiar stories that I would have come across of people who might not have seen themselves as worthy of help, or they might have had a thought pattern that someone else is worse off than me. And it's that kind of dismissing our own feelings and experiences. So what that might look like in terms of behavior would be not voicing our concerns or needs, maybe because we don't feel worthy of having an opinion, maybe we don't feel worthy of asking for help, like in that scenario, or maybe we are kind of feeling like an imposter in our work, comparing ourselves to others, or just not feeling able to speak up because of that low self-worth. So as I mentioned with shame, we harshly judge ourselves, but we also have an intense fear of being judged or rejected by others. So it's that real fear of disconnect, or that fear of kind of rejection. And it's our instinct to hide anything that we are ashamed of. So if we're ashamed of some part of our mental health, or some part of us that feels unacceptable or wrong, we are going to try and hide it. And that's going to look like misrepresentation. So what that will, I suppose, present itself like in terms of behavior could be things like maybe taking loans out to buy things with money that we don't have, telling stories about things that we didn't do, or seeking an awful lot of external validation. So that's that misrepresentation piece. So hypervigilance then, avoiding others and hypervigilance are behaviors that are associated with shame, but all of us unfortunately are very familiar with hypervigilance because we were forced to adopt a lot of those behaviors during the pandemic. So especially if you combine that hypervigilance that we were all forced to adopt with the low self-worth, you know, I felt I was doing this idea that you might have felt you were doing others a favor by removing yourself from their lives or events, whereas during the pandemic we actually were doing people a favor by removing ourselves from their lives and events. So it can be a little bit muddled. There was an awful lot of social anxiety and paranoia that resulted from the pandemic. So there is some challenges there with hypervigilance. And I suppose compounding those factors then is this like culture that we all have in Ireland of not talking about our feelings, or we're not very good at it. And the example I like to give here is, think about when you ask someone for a cup of tea, and even if you're gasping for a cup of tea, you might say, oh, I'm grand, even when you're absolutely dying. And you might have to ask someone a second time, and then they'll say, oh, actually, I'd love a cup of tea. And often we kind of can do that in Ireland with our feelings as well. We might say, I'm grand, even when we are far, far from it. And that's because, that's especially the case if we're ashamed of how we're feeling and we're hiding something about our mental well-being. So just in terms of less common mental health challenges, then I suppose anxiety and depression were brought to the fore a lot during the pandemic. They were talked about a lot, and most of us feel comfortable with mental health in that respect. And they're well accepted, I suppose, in Irish society. But beyond that, there are other mental health challenges like schizophrenia, borderline personality disorder, and bipolar. And there's a lot of shame and stigma still surrounding those mental health challenges. So there is a lot of work required to shift that stigma, because people are a little bit, I suppose, afraid of what they don't understand. So that's just another one to be mindful of. So ways to decrease internal shame. So I suppose the first point there is to learn about ourselves. If we know more about our own mental health, we're more able to identify myths and maybe challenge myths that we might have heard in the past. We'll learn that recovery is possible, and also it will give us maybe a better understanding of ourselves, which means we're more likely to be, I suppose, a little bit kinder to ourselves. And when we know more about our own mental health, we have that little bit of a sense of empowerment. So to learn about your diagnosis or to learn about your own mental health, yourmentalhealth.ie is a great place to start. They have kind of an A to Z of different mental health challenges, or Mental Health Ireland have some great resources as well. Another way to decrease internal shame can be to join a peer support group. Peer support can really help with that self-worth piece because it boosts our empowerment, and also peers connections can really promote that sense of belonging, and sense of belonging we know is really, really crucial for our mental well-being. And especially if we are having maybe some self-stigma. So we believe that we might be going to be treated worse because of our diagnosis. If we are in a peer support group and we meet with people who might have had similar experiences, that can really help us to feel less alone in that feeling of self-stigma. So some nationwide peer support groups would be Aware, Shine, and Grow Mental Health. I'm sure we can pop it into the chat function at the end, but there are also advocacy groups like Sea Change. We have an ambassador from Sea Change on today, and Sea Change are always looking for volunteers as well. And once a year they run an advocacy campaign. So that could be, Sea Change is a great organization to become a part of as well. Lastly, then, empowering ourselves with coping skills. So what works for my mental health might not work for your mental health, and vice versa. We're all very, very different and very, very individual. So it's about investigating. And then when I know what works for my mental health, it's going to improve my self-esteem because I feel I have those coping mechanisms in place when things aren't going my way. A great way to do this would be to work with a counsellor or psychotherapist, but I'm fully aware that that is not always available in Ireland because of long waiting lists and cost barriers. For those of us joining from AIR, you have access to your EAP, which is a great resource. But there are some, as I said, some great resources available on yourmentalhealth.ie, or there's another website called getselfhelp.co.uk, which has some brilliant resources to just help us with that empowerment piece. And then lastly, just to decrease shame in society. Again, education is really key. So if we have the facts about our mental health conditions, it will help us to have better compassion for ourselves. It will help us to have better compassion for others. And it really helps us to recognize any myths. And when we're empowered and more informed with the information on our mental health, it's a lot easier to have those conversations. So the conversations with our families, our friends, and our work colleagues, you know, they're so important for breaking down that stigma and that feeling of shame. And as Donie mentioned, you know, the conversation doesn't need to be completely mental health focused. It can be just included as part of an everyday chat, and that will really help to just normalize the conversation. So something like, you know, I went out for a lovely walk this morning. I love walking. It really is great for my mental health. You know, something small like that, it can just help to normalize that sort of conversation piece. To the next point there, be willing to listen. So this is really, really important, allowing those around us to speak about their experience. So let's say a family member or a friend was to come to us with a mental health difficulty. It's really important to try and practice active listening without thinking about how to respond, or without trying to think about how that might relate to a similar experience that you had. Try to just be really present with the person and hold the space, and give them as much time as you possibly can to help them to feel comfortable and safe. And so for the last point there, language is really, really important. So and I think the media has a huge responsibility here as well, but it's just for everybody on the call, if you can take one thing away from it, and this can be the thing, if you just have a little bit more awareness around your language, it can make such a difference for people, because we don't know what labels people have what labels people come to us with when we meet them. So using words like kind of crazy or manic or psycho, like work is so crazy or the traffic is so mad, you know, we use them so flippantly, we use them all the time, but those words can actually be very, very hurtful to somebody who might have been labeled as that in the past. And they can really fuel stigma as well. So if you are in a position and you do feel comfortable to challenge the language, maybe, I suppose, focus on the language rather than the person. Say, you could say something like, you know, I read that it's better not to say the word manic when we're talking about being busy, you know, rather than saying, you know, you're being stigmatizing, just to try and, I suppose, nobody likes confrontation, but that could be a way to try and ease into it, and just to try and be aware of when we're using those words quite frequently, because we just don't know who they could be hurtful to. So that's a real whistle-top tour, a very quick tour, because I know we're tight on time. But those are some of the ways to decrease shame, be that internal or external. And remember that the EAP is available to all AIR employees. If you have any additional questions, you can reach me on my email address there, and there will be further signposting provided at the end for any of the people on the call who are not AIR employees. So thanks very much. That was my very quick. I know we're on a schedule, so.
No, thanks, Claire. And again, it's great.
Keep it quick.
Thanks. Well, it's great to kind of get the introduction to the behavior piece in terms of what it is and what it kind of looks like, and kind of how people act as a result of it. But kind of the one thing in terms of decreasing the internal shame, I suppose, kind of learning about ourselves, the peer support, but those coping skills is kind of what stood out for me in terms of the first time you go to try address the issue you have, it might not be the approach that works for you, and it's kind of working at it and trying to figure out, I suppose, what is the best approach for you in terms of managing your mental health.
Yeah, it's so different, so individual.
Thanks very much. And as I said, we have time for questions at the end, and I'll just move across now to our next speaker. And basically, that is Nick. So Nicholas Nally, and basically in his listening and outreach roles, Nicholas brings his own experience and the extensive body of knowledge built over 50 years of working experience with Dublin Samaritans, providing emotional support to callers who are experiencing despair, depression, distress, or suicidal feelings. So I think focusing in, I suppose, in terms of this particular piece of the effects of the chronic shame or toxic shame. So thanks, Nicholas.
Thanks, Donie. Really delighted to be here today, and really happy on your description around how AIR are managing mental health within the organisation and taking that whole holistic approach. Happy to hear that, because I was an employee of AIRCom for many years, so really happy to see that what's happening there. Yeah, I'm a volunteer for over 7 years. People will be familiar, I hope, with the service we offer. We offer a 24/7 service to people who are feeling overwhelmed, anxious, distressed, suicidal. And we provide that 365 days of the year. We also, and this is my area of responsibility, we have a strong outreach team, and we work with schools, universities, different organizations, workplaces in bringing our experience of mental health and to help those organizations improve mental health within their companies. I'll just share, hopefully.
That's perfect, thank you.
Okay. And maybe to touch on that, and Claire made reference to this around stigmas. So a lot of it is externally driven and outside of our control. The socially constructed stigma, where society puts labels on us as persons and effectively devalue the individual. And then within organizations, what's called structural stigma, where the policies, the practices of the organization actually restricts the rights of people living with mental illness. And those policies and those cultures can actually prevent full participation by that person and prevent them seeking open conversations within the organization. The other driver is internal, and this is where the individual internalizes the negative stereotypes from society, from the organization, and that can result in low self-esteem, shame, and hopelessness. And that can make it even more difficult to reach out and get the support they need. Addressing stigma. So stigma can inhibit individuals from reaching out, as I said, for the support when the most needed. And it's important that organizations like ourselves that provide support services, we recognize that in the service we offer and how we offer those services. We need to create an environment where somebody feels comfortable and able to share their experiences when they choose to do that. So in other words, when somebody makes a brave decision to reach out, call an organization like Samaritans, that the reception they'll get will be a trusted, confidential, but importantly, non-judgmental response. It's also important to us in terms of the services that we provide, that we include people, with the lived experience and informing what we do, informing the services we offer and how we offer those services. In our outreach, we work with organizations and companies to understand within their organization what are the barriers, if you like, to actually providing an appropriate emotional support, an appropriate environment, and to recognize where stigmas are embedded within their organization. They're usually specific to the organization, and equally the solutions are also specific to that organization in identifying and removing such barriers. Getting support. As I said, a factor that prevents or makes it difficult to seek support and undermines that support is the stigma that can be associated with mental illness. There are many barriers that a person has to overcome before they actually reach out. And that makes that exercise difficult. Layer over stigma, and that compounds that. As a consequence, People distressed by mental health illnesses often don't seek out the services or choose fully not to engage with them. In creating the services, providing those services, we need to create a space and listen to those who have lived and are living the experience of mental illness. The Samaritans' vision is that fewer people die by suicide. And we've certain values that we apply when we do that. And each volunteer in each call would apply those values. The values are useful because we can apply them in everyday life. We can apply them when we see a family member or a colleague, we can see they're struggling. And those values underpin how we actually support such person. The importance of listening, and Claire made reference to this. We need to give 100% to what the person is actually reaching out to us. It's not about us. The conversation has to be all about them. So we need to use active listening techniques. The discussion has to be confidential. They need to know they're talking to somebody that they can trust. It needs to be non-judgmental. We need to leave our own, if you like, moral values outside of that discussion. The importance of human contact. That is really key, that there's a caring person involved in this conversation. We firmly believe in not giving advice. We believe in the importance of people making their own decisions. People know their own situation and their own experience best. As I said, Samaritans Call or Support provide a 24/7 service for people who are in distress or feeling suicidal. What's really important is in this type of support is to recognize that everybody's experience is unique. They have a different life experience, different supports, different resources, and resilience. We should never judge or put weight on what somebody is actually trying to cope on. We should not measure it by our own or somebody else's tells that we know their experience. We need to take ourselves out of the conversation. We do not judge from a moral position, and equally, we don't measure against our own life experience. We can fall into that trap where we listen to something a caller is struggling with, and we weigh it up against our own experience. This is their life. This is their struggle. We need to avoid assumptions. And we need to be very careful that we don't claim to understand the caller's struggles. They know that best, and we must give them the opportunity to tell us what they're struggling with. And lastly, we don't offer advice. In our outreach, we work with organizations and businesses in providing workshops that look at and explore structural stigma to identify within those organizations barriers to listening, barriers to inclusion. People in those organizations often are not aware of such barriers, are not aware how it's having a negative impact in people within the organization, people that feel possibly excluded because of stigma that's embedded in the organization's policies, the organization's culture. So what we do in these workshops is we work with the attendees to identify barriers that would actually prevent somebody reaching out and seeking support. And once we identify barriers particular to that organization, we work with the attendees to identify what can be done to remove those barriers. And these are specific, as I said, to each organization. And the people who come to the workshops are best positioned to identify and to seek potential solutions to that. We also explore and practice techniques and support tools that individuals can use to support each other to become a more inclusive organization. What we find is within particularly work organizations, people can have a set of tools that are more appropriate to problem solvings or discussions that always end in outcomes, but are not really useful or practical in giving support to somebody who needs that, who needs to have a conversation around what they're struggling with, around what emotions are overwhelming them. Just a picture of our office in Marlborough Street, and that's our contact number for anybody who wants to reach out to us at any time, day or night. Thanks for your time.
Nicholas, thank you very much. And I suppose thank you for all the work that you do in Samaritans. Kind of, for me, the outreach piece, I suppose, is kind of very important in terms of that role. Is getting out there and getting kind of the discussion with people to basically kind of maybe show them how they can manage these issues at an earlier stage before they get themselves into difficulty, when that could be a much harder time to kind of address the issues. But I suppose from our own perspective, the structural piece is kind of where we really need to bed in and focus on. And I suppose kind of the thing that you kept referencing throughout was trust, I think. And I suppose trusting that, you know, if you do seek the assistance, and, you know, there's a long road travel before that actually happens. If you do seek the help, that there's good structures in place, and there's clarity and kind of understanding as to what is going to be delivered for that person when they come forward, you know. And it's hugely important for us in there. Thanks very much, Nicholas. I just moved on to Eoin. So I suppose Eoin is our Sea Change ambassador, 39 from Dublin. Some may recognise him. He's featured on a documentary Unspoken on RTE in 2021. And basically at that time, Eoin revealed what it was like living with an eating disorder, particularly as a male in Ireland. And while he lives with other various mental illnesses such as OCD, they don't stop him from feeling the most at home, being active in or on the sea, kite surfing, and stand-up paddle boarding. So welcome Eoin, and thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Donie, and thank you everyone for coming along today and being willing to explore the topic of shame, which is something that I've explored in depth over the last few years. And I'll talk a little bit about how that's happened, or how I got to that point. Before I do, I just want to share just one image with you for a second. If I can do that, let me just see now. Just want to share. So I'm going to just share an image with you, but maybe I can't. No, okay, it doesn't seem to want to come up for me for some reason. No, sorry, we'll move on from that. So just to tell you my story, I'm recently a Sea Change ambassador, and I will explain why I became a Sea Change ambassador towards the end of my talk today. But to go back a few years, I've been on this planet for 39 years, And of those 39 years, I've probably been living with shame in various forms for all of them, without realizing it. And it's only in the past few years that I've begun to join the dots and see the different forms of shame that I've lived with. As long as I can remember, I've lived with obsessive compulsive disorder, but didn't actually know what that was. It was not something that anyone else in my family lived with, and it was not something that any of us had a lived experience of. But as I remember back to being a child, I can remember various forms of compulsions and obsessions that I would have had, that were in a way laughed at. They were laughed off. Rather than laughed at, they were laughed off and kind of dismissed as, that's just something that a kid does, or something that he'll grow out of it. And that probably, in its own insidious little way, compounded shame year on year as I grew older. It kind of developed into something that became something I was confused about. I didn't understand, why did I live with these obsessions? Why did I live with these compulsions? I never explored why or what or how they came about. Fast forward then into my early 20s and early 30s, and I was living a very regular life. I was in the general career growth path, if you want to call it that, where I was working towards promotions, working towards bigger salaries, achievements, better jobs in whatever form they were judged. And I use the word judged there because it's important. Was I being true to myself, or was I being true to others? That was something I wasn't sure about at the time, but I felt like I had to achieve for others. I had to deliver for others above and beyond myself, and that was what I was being taught in life, was that I had to deliver for either my family, for my partner, or for those that I was working with, and I became a yes man. I became a man who was afraid to say no. I was afraid to annoy others by saying no, but sometimes saying yes to my detriment, because I would find that I couldn't deliver. And if I couldn't deliver to what I had said yes to, that generated shame. So that compounded on top of the shame of OCD. We then got to a point where I was very happily in a relationship, and still am, with my partner. But we were moving on in life and hearing, you need to start a family, you need to settle down, you need to get that house, you need to do all of the 2.47 children scenario that we've heard for many years as to what is acceptable in the world. Again, I wasn't anywhere near that. I didn't see myself in a place where I was secure enough to start a family. I didn't see myself in a place where I could even achieve, buying a house. They didn't align with my values either. That was, at the time, my values were different. My values felt like they were different. I didn't feel the need, like I wanted to, show my achievements through owning a house. I wanted to show my achievements in different ways. So again, that compounded onto, the other shames that I'd been growing up with. And all of this, I suppose what I'm trying to show is that I don't live with a significant physical abuse event, sexual abuse event. I don't live with a significant emotional abuse event. For me, shame built itself in lots of small little ways that just compounded themselves and built on top of each other. To the point where in 2018, end of 2018, start of 2019, I decided I wanted to be a better person. I didn't quite know what better meant, but I didn't feel like I was good enough in this world. I didn't feel like I was going to match up to anyone around me. I felt like my value and my self-worth were nowhere near what they needed to be in comparison to others. And I was constantly relating myself to others around me. I'd lost all of my own ability to feel comfortable in my own skin. And that developed into an eating disorder. I won't go into all the details of the behaviours of that eating disorder, except just to say it was restrictive. And the reason I do point out the word restrictive is it gave me control over something in a world where I felt I had no control. I had no control over what other people thought of me. I had no control over, you know, how people judged me in this world. And by developing my eating disorder, or by taking on this path to being a better person through restricting my food, I felt like I could finally control something. I could see achievement. I could see, you know, different results, you know, that felt to me like they were good. Fast forward a little bit further, and very quickly, by probably about 6 months later, I was in a suicidal state. My physical and mental health had deteriorated to a point where I couldn't leave the house. I couldn't get out of bed, both for physical and mental reasons. I had no energy left, but I also had no mental capacity to exist in this world. And very much I became a shell. I became a person who, you know, just did not have any real existence other than just a heartbeat. But you know, couldn't participate in daily life anymore. And I considered taking my life. I considered that was the route that was going to solve this problem. I couldn't understand. I still had logical thinking, you know, but I couldn't understand why none of this had worked. Why all of a sudden I, you know, found myself in an even worse place than I had been 7 or 8 months ago, or previous. Thankfully, I didn't take my life, and I look back at that now with pride. I spoke out at the time. I remember it vividly. I was in the same room as my mother at the time, and I just turned around to her in floods of tears, and I said, you know, Mum, here's what I'm thinking about. Here's what I'm absolutely fixated on, and I'm scared of it. And that was probably the turning point, because 2 days later, I found myself in a residential facility, or a residential home, a residential house for people with eating disorders. And, you know, you can say people with eating disorders, people living with eating disorders, but we were also people living with mental illness, lots of various mental illnesses. And eating disorder is just the rash on the skin, which is manifesting the, you know, as the allergy that's underneath. And that's what we began to learn. But before I went into that house, again, talking about shame, I was so scared of going in there because I was worried I was going to be the only male. I was also going to be middle-aged. I was going to be 36 at the time. Was it just going to be me and a whole lot of young girls, or you know, gay men? The stereotypes that we see out there, and I just point them out as stereotypes, not for any other reason. And I was looking at you know, what I could find online, you know, who I could see talking about eating disorders, anything relative out there, and I couldn't find anything that was relative to me, which was scary, very, very scary, and again compounded the shame. And so before I went into that facility, I was isolated, I was vulnerable, and I was really scared, and that was what shame brought to me. 2 weeks into that, living in that facility, which I went into for 3 months, I very quickly realized that we were all just humans, and we were all just humans just trying to find a solution to similar problems, manifesting themselves in different ways. Didn't matter whether we were female, male, young, old, you know, or whatever gender, you know, we recognized ourselves as or identified as. We were all just humans with a heartbeat trying to solve a problem. And so that then allowed the shame to dissipate a little bit. It allowed the shame to slowly get diluted. Not to solve it straight away, but just to make it feel easier to exist in this world, and feel easier to be around others and not feel like you have to be as good as them, or you know, better than them. And that's actually quite difficult when you're living with an eating disorder, particularly a restrictive one. There's a competitive side to that. You want to be, you know, more restrictive than others. You want to see better achievements than others, and that's a hard thing to overcome. But the way we overcame that was we spoke together. We spoke in groups. We spoke in tribes, in a community. We removed the isolation of mental illness and our negative mental health. And there's a difference between the two. You know, I live with mental illness, but that doesn't mean that I can't have a positive mental health day. I can have a positive mental health day and feel great and still live with my mental illness. So it's important to define those two as being separate. But going back to that idea of talking together, talking to people who get it, talking to people who didn't judge it. Nicholas mentioned that in his slides there about being non-judgmental, not trying to find the solutions for other people, just listening. And if you can do that for someone in your life, you don't know what you'll do for them in terms of helping them to reduce their shame. There's one thing I've tried to do in my life nowadays where I don't live with challenges anymore. I don't try and challenge myself to anything anymore. I experiment with things, and I experiment with things because for me, what I've taught myself is that challenges can lead to success or failure. And as a result of success or failure, I'm either good or I'm not good. Whereas if I experiment with things, I either have positive or negative results, which I can take with me to learn for the next time I try and do that and maybe change the outcome. But it doesn't mean I've failed. I don't fail at an experiment. So for me, you know, it's about changing my language and it's changing my mindset. Changing language, I don't use the word should anymore, or at least I try as best as I can to not use it. Should implies judgment. It implies that I should do something because someone else is telling me to do it or my mind is telling me to do it, rather than I can do something or I could consider doing something once I weigh up all the pros and cons of it and make a decision. So that's, I suppose, how I've learned to come through treatment and learn to reframe my mind to help me live with some of the shame that I still live with to this day. You know, I still have triggers that can set me off very quickly. I could be in a really wonderful frame of mind trying to help someone with the problem on the water or off the water, and they might just say one thing and all of a sudden I go down a rabbit hole. They may not have meant anything by it, but it's what I'll take from it, and that's where my shame is still there. It's like an echo chamber, and all it takes is one little knock of the bell, and next thing it keeps ringing, and you've got to try and soften the sound of that bell. But one other thing I want to just show you as part of my presentation today is when I was in treatment, I explored various different types of treatment, group therapy, individual one-on-one psychotherapy. But one thing I came across was art therapy. And art therapy for me, I'm not an artist. I can't draw a stick man to save my life. But I can, or what I've found is I can use art to explain my thinking, explain my thought processes. And I just want to introduce you just to one thing I did in my art therapy when I was in residential treatment, which I think highlights shame in a very visual way, or at least the way I've discovered it. So bear with me, because this is the first time I've ever shown these publicly in such an obvious way. They mean a huge amount to me, what I'm about to show you, because I put my heart and soul into these. I really did. So I just want to show you. This is a mask that I created in just a very ad hoc therapy section that we had one day. It wasn't planned. We were just presented with masks and we were asked to paint on them whatever we wanted to paint on them. Some people just took them and put glitter all over them and made them look pretty. Some other people, you know, did nothing with them. This is what I chose to do with them, and I didn't actually really think about it beforehand. But I want you to have a look at that mask, and I want you to see what you can see in it yourself, and then I'll explain what I see in it, or the reason it's painted like that. So just for 5 or 10 seconds, just have a think of that. What are the immediate thoughts that come into your head as you look at that mask? For me, the reason that mask is designed like that is this is the mask that I lived with shame, and this is what I lived with before I went into treatment. It was a mask of very black and white thinking, and so that's, you know, hence the colors of black and white. Sharp lines. There was no degree of flexibility in my life in 2018, 2019. It was all about control. It was all about, you know, I was taking control of everything and I couldn't find a moment of grey in the day. So I had black and white, controlled, sharp thinking. It looks a little bit like, if you can remember the Hamburglar out of the McDonald's ads, it robbed me of my joy of food. It robbed me of my joy of life. It robbed me of everything, everything that was dear to me. And if you can see, and I'll hold it up to the screen, which way do I need to go? This way. You can see little dots of colour. I'm not sure if it'll come through on the screen, but between the black lines on the white lines, you'll see little dots of colour. And those dots of colour, just remember them for the next thing that I show you. And the next thing that I'm going to show you is this mask, which sits alongside it. This mask is the second mask I created that day. And this mask is me. This mask is my values. And this mask is the mask that the other one was hiding. This mask, the colours all represent different things. And they're the values that I learned. I learned who I was. And I'll just explain them to you just, you know, in detail. There's still obviously a little bit of black and white thinking, because we need black and white thinking in our lives to protect ourselves. You know, do we run out in front of the car? Do we not? That's not really a grey area. That's just, you know, safety and protection. So you can see black along this eye and white just under this eye here. But as well as that, then you'll see red here around that eye and red in the brain. And that's love. You know, I'm a loving person. I love my family. I love my friends. And I want them to see that. I want them to see that I'm a loving and enthusiastic person in their lives. You'll also see then that I have blue here and I have blue here. Again, I'm thinking about myself. I'm minding myself at all times. I'm being self-caring to myself. In a way, I'm being selfish, but I've learned that selfish is a good thing. Selfish is not a bad thing, because you're protecting yourself, you're looking after yourself. So I'm thinking about myself well, and I'm also breathing fresh air, I'm breathing good air, I'm looking after myself in terms of my well-being. I then also have the green, which is here, and that's specifically under the chin as a trusted friend, that if someone else is hanging with their chin down like that, I'll come along and I'll put their chin up. I'll hold their chin up. I'm a trusted friend. I'm someone who you can rely on and believe in. And then you've also got the yellow here, which is the welcoming face. And the welcoming face is just a smile. I remember hearing over, you know, so many years, why don't you smile in photographs on? Why don't you put a smile on your face? It's just the way my face is. But I felt so much shame for so many years because so many people told me you don't look happy. But I was happy. I was happy deep down. And yet I couldn't understand why people didn't see that. You know, so I want people to see that I am happy, even if I don't have a big grin on my face. You know, I am happy. And then the last one is orange, and orange is just basically the idea of being enthusiastic in life, but, you know, being mindful of myself as well. So that was the mask that I discovered was myself. But for so long, it was covered by that one. And that was how I discovered shame, or how I learned what the shame that I was living with was. So these little colours, they were trying to get through, but this one was keeping them hidden. And that's the end of what I wanted to say to you today.
Thank you very much, Eoin. Wow, that was a fantastic presentation. And again, thank you very much for kind of coming along today and sharing your experience. And I know you mentioned the art therapy. It's not something you've kind of shown to too many people before, but in terms of that was excellent. And I suppose I wouldn't consider myself a good speaker in terms of hosting events, so I'm going to not be able to justify in terms of our appreciation to you for kind of sharing your experiences with us today. So thank you for that. The one thing I kind of jumped out in terms of the story you've told us is kind of that transient shame, and kind of the over time, I suppose the events and the issues that kind of happen to us now can kind of come back and kind of affect us later in later generations. And I think that's kind of, we all have to be mindful of that in terms of, you know, kind of everybody has a responsibility now to look at the language and the way that we discuss these topics, and kind of ensure that we're kind of planting the seeds now for a better future in terms of kind of the generations ahead. So again, thank you very much, and thank you to all my speakers, Claire, Farrell and Nicholas Nally. I think we have a small bit of time now for a Q&A session. And I said I'm not 100% on the Zoom, but I'm sure the busy bees in the background will help me out here. So just one question in here. So, any tips for normalizing having mental health conversations in the workplace? So Claire, that kind of jumps out at me as one you could take for us.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question, and thanks a million, Eoin, for sharing that. That was brilliant. I suppose one of the things that I had mentioned when I was chatting there was just to have just the casual thing, like not to make your make it mental health focused. So I suppose we wouldn't want to go up to our colleague and say, how is your mental health today, you know, and have a very formal approach to it, but maybe just dropping things into conversation like, oh, I went for a run this morning, it's great for my mental health, or just small things like that could really help. In addition as well, of course, the Sea Change campaign is a great one for really breaking down those barriers. Like I see that Donie, yourself, you have the Sea Change ribbon on, and like even things like that throughout the workplace really help people feel a little bit more comfortable talking about those things. And I know Samaritans, Nicholas mentioned that Samaritans do a workplace specific workshop, and Sea Change do as well. So October is World Mental Health Day, and it's World Mental Health Month. So it could be like October is a perfect time to try and put in place maybe some seminars or events or workshops if you're interested in breaking down those stigma. Working with the likes of Sea Change or the likes of Samaritans could be a great place to start.
Very good, thanks, Claire. And I suppose Sea Change, it's the Green Ribbon campaign is for the month of September, but the topics are there and the supports are there all year round.
Exactly.
So I suppose any other questions before we wrap up? I don't think so. So again, look, thanks very much for for joining us today. And I suppose just before we move on, there'll be a feedback form sent on from Sea Change afterwards, and be very much appreciated if you fill in that form. And thanks very much for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Could I just come in there just for 1 second? I just see
Yeah.
one question that's come in there, which I think I'd love to just take 2 minutes just to answer if I could, because I think it's
Please do, yeah.
quite an important one in the world we live in today, which was just specifically wondering about when I was at my lowest, were you regularly in a workplace and did you receive support? And to answer that question specifically for myself, no, I wasn't. I was running my own business and I was working from home. And as a result, I was isolated. I was very much on my own, working in front of a screen in the same four walls with no one else in the house nearly every day. And that compounded the mental illness, or the destructive behaviors, because I found that I couldn't talk to anyone then. So, you know, certainly if you are working in a workplace and you have something like an EAP available, or just general, you know, social activities, or you just have someone sitting beside you, you know, at a screen, at a desk beside you, you know, use that support. It is really, really helpful.
Excellent. Thanks, Eoin. Good spot on the question there. So that's it, folks. Thanks very much. Take care.